promise to boost military support for Ukraine.
The sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil are significant because they target the two biggest energy providers in Russia together.
Things are turning upside down in Russia. Political and social fractures have reached an unprecedented level. The cause of this fracture is not only the bad news coming from the front lines. The real turning point is that the cost of the war has begun to directly affect every Russian citizen's pocket, table, and future. But the Kremlin's agenda is very different. Russia is planning to dig a tunnel to Alaska. This is no joke. It is the absolute madness of a regime in its final moments. This madness was announced by Vladimir Putin's special representative and head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, Kirill Dmitriev. Russia is planning a feasibility study for a project to connect Asia and North America with a tunnel under the Bering Strait. The Kremlin has not even managed to lay a clean water pipeline from the city of Rostov, just a few hundred kilometers away, to the city of Donetsk in Ukraine, which it has occupied for 10 years. But let's take this project put on the table by the Kremlin seriously for a moment, because US President Trump also found the project interesting and did not hide his curiosity and desire to discuss it. The Alaska Tunnel project is not a new idea. The idea of a tunnel under the Bering Strait between Alaska and Russia is a massive mega-project that has been discussed for many years, known as the Bering Strait Tunnel or the Intercontinental Peace Bridge. It has been a dream that has been brought up from time to time since the days of Tsarist Russia, but has always been shelved as fantastic. The basic idea of the project was to connect Russia's Chukotka Peninsula with the US state of Alaska via a railway and/or road tunnel approximately 100 kilometers long, passing under the Bering Strait. The technical and financial absurdity of this project proves that the Kremlin is out of touch with reality. The narrowest point of the Bering Strait is approximately 88 kilometers. However, a longer route would likely be needed to build a stable tunnel. This is more than twice the length of the Channel Tunnel, and it cannot even be compared to a project like the Kerch Bridge, which Putin barely managed to complete and boasts about. Furthermore, the depth of the strait and the seismic activity of the region will make construction extremely difficult. The region has one of the harshest climates in the world. Frozen ground for most of the year, massive ice masses, and temperatures reaching -50 degrees Celsius turn both the construction and operation of the tunnel into an engineering nightmare. The melting of permafrost threatens the tunnel's structure, while ice masses can block the entrances and exits. Chukotka and Alaska, at either end of the tunnel, are among the world's most isolated and underdeveloped regions. Simply transporting the millions of tons of concrete, steel, massive tunnel boring machines, and tens of thousands of workers needed to build the tunnel to these regions is a logistical nightmare in itself. Existing rail and road networks cannot handle this load. Thousands of kilometers of new access roads would need to be built, which would multiply the project's cost and duration. Past estimates of the project's cost alone reached hundreds of billions of dollars. Focusing solely on the tunnel section, i.e., crossing the narrowest point of the strait, approximately 88 kilometers, 55 miles long, probably using the Diomede Islands in the middle, various engineering analyses predict that the cost would be between $30 and $50 billion. However, the project's truly massive cost stems not from the tunnel itself, but from its connections on both continents. Both Alaska's Wales region and Russia's Chukotka Peninsula are hundreds, even thousands of kilometers away from existing major highway or railway networks. When this connection infrastructure is taken into account, especially on the Russian side to connect to the Trans-Siberian Railway, the total cost of the project is expected to reach between $100 billion and $200 billion. However, this is an estimate valid for today. The remoteness of these regions, as mentioned earlier, and the difficulties of building on permafrost, permanently frozen soil, multiply the costs. A similar situation applies to the timeline. While the construction of the tunnel alone in harsh Arctic conditions is estimated to take 10 to 15 years, the entire project, including all connecting roads and railways, is expected to take 20 to 30 years from planning to completion. Given today's technology, inflation, and the project's enormous scale and timeline, it is not unreasonable to expect the cost to reach trillions of dollars. This is more than half of Russia's current GDP. Russia is experiencing its darkest days in the last quarter century. As refineries are blown up one by one, 84% of the country is struggling with the worst fuel shortage in its history. Major Russian companies are going bankrupt, and the economy and inflation are sounding the alarm. The high cost of living, fuel crises, huge gas queues, and collapsing public services have exhausted the patience of the people. As this social patience reached breaking point, silence began to give way to loud criticism. Some Russian journalists working for state media are now issuing warnings directly targeting Putin and his regime. Dmitry Shechin, editor of the Komsomolskaya Pravda newspaper, was a loyal supporter of Putin at the beginning of the war. But today, the same man is openly saying that if the problems faced by the people are not solved, it could lead to the collapse of the regime and the end of Putin. Dozens of city council members in major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg are calling for the Russian leader to resign. It is unrealistic for a country crushed by a war economy, and with giants like Gazprom going bankrupt to bear such a cost. And perhaps most importantly, for whom is this tunnel being built? One end of the tunnel is on US soil, which Russia views as its arch-enemy. With relations between Russia and the US worse than during the Cold War, it is politically naive to imagine the two countries collaborating on such a massive and strategic project. Furthermore, the security risks that such a tunnel would create from a military perspective are unacceptable for both countries. Despite this mountain of technical, financial, and geopolitical impossibilities, the Kremlin's decision to bring this project to the agenda in October 2025 is sheer madness. The most symbolic and daring act of this wave of courageous rebellion came from the Smolenskoye District Council in St. Petersburg. This local council went far beyond a simple call for resignation, breaking Russia's biggest taboo. The council members submitted an official request to the State Duma, Russia's parliament, demanding that Vladimir Putin be removed from office on charges of treason due to the war in Ukraine. This was a step equivalent to political suicide. To label a war that Putin called a special military operation and presented as a sacred patriotic duty as treason against the country meant declaring direct war on the regime's entire propaganda apparatus and legal coercion mechanism. However, these council members had constructed their arguments in an extremely careful and legalistic manner based on the regime's own constitution and laws. In their petition, they summarized how Putin's actions harmed Russia in 4 key points. These key points were the destruction of the army, demographic catastrophe, economic collapse, and strategic defeat. Of course, these Duma members did not harbor any illusions that the State Duma would process this petition and put Putin on trial. Their goal was different. Their goal was to light a torch, and they achieved it. These calls are not limited to liberal centers, but are spreading to regions that have paid the heaviest price for the war and are economically oppressed. Because living in Russia has now become, in the truest sense of the word, a battle for survival. Analyses by independent polling companies and reputable institutions, such as the Journal of Democracy, reveal the depth of this change. 57% of the population now say they support peace talks. The percentage of those who want the war to continue has fallen to 35%. In other words, it was understood that there would be no peace in Russia while Putin was in power. Another point these results indicate is that Putin must now leave, step down from his position, because the international sanctions now in place, rising inflation, and the increasing cost of the war at the front have placed an unbearable burden on ordinary citizens. To better understand this madness, we must go back in time. First and foremost comes the collapse of Russia's economic power and the financial foundation of the Putin regime. Basic products such as oil, milk, and pasta are either very expensive or completely sold out on supermarket shelves. It has become difficult to find many medicines in pharmacies. However, perhaps the most striking area of crisis has been the fuel shortage. Not only driving a car, but also heating, transportation, and even sending children to school has become impossible. On the other side of this tragic equation are the babushkas, millions of elderly Russians who have served this state throughout their lives and endured hardships are now being betrayed by their own government. The process that began with the 2018 pension reform and continued with the raising of the retirement age to 65 for men and 60 for women fundamentally shook this generation's trust in the state. This is the state's attempt to finance the war by further shrinking the morsel in the throats of its most vulnerable citizens. Efforts to turn to China, however, failed to even come close to the revenue obtained from Europe due to Beijing's ruthless bargaining. As the economic foundation crumbled, Ukraine's asymmetric genius took center stage. Starting in early 2024, Ukrainian drones began systematically striking oil refineries in the European part of Russia. Ukraine was inflicting millions of dollars in damage to Russia's billion-dollar refinery infrastructure, with drones costing a few $1,000s. And the time tunnel brings us to mid-October 2025, when the Kremlin was dreaming of Alaska. Ukraine's drone attacks reached their peak of devastation, now targeting not just oil refineries, but the most critical and vulnerable points of Russia's energy infrastructure. The most destructive attack was on the facility in Orenburg, one of Russia's and the world's largest natural gas processing plants. This facility was vital not only for Russia's domestic consumption, but also for exports to Central Asia. The fire caused by Ukrainian drones hitting this massive complex was visible for miles and reduced a significant part of the facility to ashes. During the same period, the Novokuybyshevsk oil refinery in Samara Oblast, a major industrial center on the Volga River, was also hit. This refinery was a critical logistics hub, particularly supplying fuel to Russia's central regions and the front lines. Why were these two attacks more significant than previous refinery attacks? The Orenburg attack demonstrated that Ukraine could now target not only oil, but also natural gas, another vital economic artery for Russia. This could have been the final blow to Gazprom's already bankrupt state. Orenburg and Novokuybyshevsk were facilities located at the very heart of Russia's energy network. Striking these facilities crippled not only production, but also the distribution of fuel throughout the country. Various levels of fuel shortages are being experienced across 84% of the Russian Federation's territory. This is not a problem affecting just a few border regions or remote Siberian towns. This is a national crisis affecting the overwhelming majority of the country, from metropolises like Moscow and St. Petersburg to the Ural Mountains, from Siberia's industrial centers to the agricultural regions in the south. Fuel is the lifeblood of a modern society. Transportation, agriculture, heating, electricity generation, emergency services, all depend on fuel. An 84% shortage means not only cars not running, but also disrupted food distribution, hospitals' generators shutting down, and the risk of people freezing in the middle of winter. This crisis did not develop slowly over months or years. This situation further fuels inequality and anger in society. According to reports, fights frequently break out among impatient people waiting in lines at gas stations. In fact, the situation is so dire that there is no longer enough fuel even for the front lines. The series of disasters for Russia did not end there. The Orenburg facility is a critical part of the Soyuz pipeline, which exports gas not only to Russia, but also to Central Asia, particularly Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is dependent on Russian gas from this pipeline for a significant portion of its domestic consumption and industry. The fire and production stoppage caused by Ukrainian drones destroying Orenburg also cut off the flow in this pipeline. Kazakhstan was forced to stop purchasing gas from Russia immediately after the Orenburg attack. Left without gas, Kazakhstan will have to turn more to China or other sources to meet its energy needs. This increases Russia's geopolitical isolation. Despite all these failures, the Kremlin's Alaska tunnel fantasy did not end. The most painful proof of how disconnected the Kremlin is from reality is its inability to solve a much simpler, much more urgent, and much closer infrastructure problem. The Kremlin has failed to lay a clean water pipeline from the city of Rostov, just a few hundred kilometers away, to the city of Donetsk in Ukraine, which it has occupied for 10 years. Donetsk and surrounding cities have suffered from chronic water shortages for years. The existing infrastructure is outdated, damaged by conflict, and access to the main water sources controlled by Ukraine has been cut off. Millions of people, just like in Crimea, are condemned to hourly water schedules, poor quality water, and hygiene problems. The Kremlin has repeatedly promised new pipelines to solve this problem, but these projects have either never started or have been left unfinished due to corruption and incompetence. Here is the critical question. How can a regime that has been unable to lay a water pipeline to Donetsk, which it claims as its own territory, just a stone's throw away for 10 years, plan to build a $1 trillion, 100-kilometer tunnel under the Bering Strait? The Alaska Tunnel project, brought to the fore in Russia, is less a technical engineering plan and more an escape fantasy born of political collapse. This project is one of the clearest indicators of how far the regime's promised vision of the future has drifted from reality, and how much the Kremlin has lost its capacity to govern the country. In truth, this project is not a plan, but a propaganda stunt. for the Kremlin can no longer offer the public a solution-oriented future. Instead, it offers a fantastical story of salvation to a society trapped by harsh realities. A mega-tunnel that will unite continents and make Russia a global center once again. It will connect Asia and America, open new trade routes, and change the global balance of power. Yet this is merely a modern and hollow repetition of the Soviet era's promises of a communist utopia. Distracting the masses with an impossible dream is a well-rehearsed method. But the issue is not just about deceiving the people. Perhaps this tunnel is a personal escape scenario constructed by the hedonistic elite in the Kremlin at a time when they sense their own demise. Perhaps they imagine that if Russia ever completely collapses, they will be able to escape to Alaska through this tunnel. This speculation alone shows that the regime has long since crossed the boundaries of reason, that its leaders are thinking not of their own people, but of their own security. History shows us that autocratic regimes entering a process of collapse lose their sense of reality in their final moments, cling to irrational projects, and invent fantasies to distract the public. The legend of Roman Emperor Nero playing the lyre while Rome burned is precisely the historical symbol of this mental disconnect. What is happening in the Kremlin today is no different. With 84% of the country running out of gasoline, supermarket shelves emptied, one of the world's largest natural gas facilities in flames, and people waiting in line for water. The Kremlin's agenda of $1 trillion tunnel project to Alaska is a grotesque portrait of a leadership detached from reality. This is no longer a solution. It is a technique of denial. Instead of fixing the crumbling infrastructure, the starving children, and the demoralized soldiers in front of the people's eyes, the regime is trying to make them forget the present with a fictional future. Such projects almost always emerge from the echo chamber that forms around the leader. Advisors who lack the courage to speak the truth flatter Putin's ego by presenting him with grandiose historical projects. The leader has lost all connection with the people, the front lines, and the reality of the economy. All that remains are the false applause he hears from his inner circle, a universe built on his own imagination and a propaganda machine trapped within. The outside world does not believe this show either. What country would fear a state that cannot protect its own energy facilities, has no deterrent other than the threat of nuclear weapons, and whose army is now filled with civilian personnel rather than military personnel? Even the feasibility study for this project shows that it is no longer a matter of strategic thinking, but rather the last escape scenario of an isolated leader. All that remains are two weapons, the nuclear arsenal and the naked apparatus of repression. But neither is enough to keep a people waiting at gas stations with jerry cans, or an army left without ammunition at the front. For the Putin regime, the question is no longer, will it be defeated? The question is, when and how? The strategic stalemate is inevitable, because the Kremlin is now merely trying to build fantastical castles on its own ashes. While the real country crumbles, the only thing being built is a fantasy. As long as the war continues, Russia's young people will continue to die on the front lines, and the anger of their families will grow. Putin is trapped in a vicious cycle of his own making. So does this mean Russia is headed for total collapse? If by collapse we mean a 1917-style revolution where the people storm the Kremlin next week, that seems unlikely in the near term. However, if collapse means a state becoming unable to perform its most basic functions, severing its ties with its people, and slowly becoming paralyzed by its own internal contradictions, then the answer is a definite yes. Russia is already in a process of slow-motion collapse. The question now is no longer whether Russia will collapse, but what will trigger this collapse and how it will unfold. Will it be a major military defeat on the battlefield? A total infrastructure disaster in the middle of winter that will affect millions of people? What are your thoughts on this matter? Please share your opinions in the comments. Thank you for watching.